Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to our panel here. My name is Ryan Allen. I'm a faculty member here at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota in the Urban and Regional Planning area. I also hold the position of Associate Dean for Research, and it's my pleasure to chair this panel on housing. As you've grown accustomed, I'm going to introduce all four panelists who will be speaking, presenting papers in this panel. And then I'll be doing timekeeping. Each speaker will have 13 minutes. I'll be flashing cards at you and then eventually waving my arms dramatically. Probably not the latter. But we will have some time for Q&A. So thanks for hanging in there. We know that the happy hour is after this. We're keenly aware. So our first paper, long-run effects of early life public housing experience, evidence from full count 1940 census data linked to the 2000 long form, will be presented by Andy Fenelon. Andy is an associate professor of epidemiology and community health at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities and the associate director of the Minnesota Population Center. Congratulations, Andy. He is a demographer interested in the effects of social policies on health. His current research examines the effects of public housing on health and economic outcomes across the life course. Second, we'll have the long tail of history using the 1940 census, 1930s redlining maps, and HRS to investigate the role of early exposures to redlining on health outcomes in older adults in the near present. This paper will be presented by Shuo Jim Huang, who is a postdoctoral fellow in population health at the University of Maryland Institute for Health Computing, where they work on mapping the social and structural determinants of health at the individual level to better understand, intervene on, and reduce health inequities. They received their PhD in health policy from the University of Maryland with a dissertation on redlining and health. Third, we have the paper Indexing Cards, linking FHA and VA borrowers to the census. This will be presented by Thomas Storrs, who is a history PhD student at the University of Virginia. His research illuminates the intersections between mortgage markets, federal selective credit programs, and metropolitan development in the mid-20th century United States. He founded the Redlining Lab with Katherine Thomas and Jacob Faber of NYU and Wenfei Zhu of UCSB. And finally, we have the paper Building a Linked Microdata Infrastructure to Study Eviction with my colleague, Nick Graetz. Nick is an assistant professor at the University of Minnesota in the Department of Sociology and the Institute for Social Research and Data Innovation. You would think I would know that one, ISRD. He is a demographer and sociologist studying the intersection of housing, population health, and political economy in the United States. Four great panelists, I should say, and we'll get started with Andy Fenelon. Thank you.
All right, thank you all for coming. So this is the first time that I'm presenting any results from this ongoing project, which is really, really exciting. And this would also be ordinarily the time in a presentation like this when I would talk about how Minneapolis is America's greatest city, blah, blah, blah. But I don't have time. I only have 13 minutes. So if you're interested in that topic, please come see me later on, and I'll be happy to talk your ear off. This is collaborative with a large group of amazing folks here at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, as well as across the US, including Michel Boudreaux, who is on the next paper as well. We could not do this work without funding from a pilot grant from the Life Course Center, who also supports this conference, then their NIAP 30. And I do also want to make the disclaimer that these are our views, not those of the US Census Bureau, even though they did provide disclosure avoidance review of these results. So into the talk. We're interested in the later life effects of public housing. And specifically, we want to know, does access to public housing as a child in 1940 affect your later life outcomes? Now, there's a precedent for this kind of relationship, the long-term effects of early life investment. And that's because we know that childhood is a critical period for long-term trajectories of health, economic well-being, and other outcomes. And in the converse, right, we can observe the signature of adverse conditions in childhood and their effects on mortality even at the oldest ages. And so it's really important to focus on what happens to you in childhood to know what's going to happen to you later in life. And this sort of long-term effects research has been done with other sorts of policy investments. And what we know from this literature is typically that investments that improve conditions in childhood have lifelong benefits for a lot of different outcomes. So there's great quasi-experimental evidence on the food stamps program, on New Deal era cash transfer programs, as well as Medicaid. Now, public housing differs from some of these other programs in that it really was a physical investment. And public housing, when the program was developed in the 1930s, looked different from what you might imagine public housing looks like. Public housing of this era was built with extremely high quality materials and craftsmanship. It had modern amenities. And this is just a few examples of public housing developments from the 1930s, and they're beautiful buildings. There was a lot of policy excitement around public housing during this era, and we have the New Deal era art to prove it. And I'm not even joking that I do think that we should get back to maybe this sort of advertisement to really generate excitement around policy investments nowadays, because it's hard to not look at these posters and get excited for this kind of large scale policy. Public housing in 1940 on Census Day existed in 46 cities, mostly in the eastern half of the United States. Minneapolis had one. There were several in large East Coast cities, and I would challenge anyone to be able to name every single city noted by one of these dots. But it's important to understand that while public housing also looked different than you might imagine, it didn't serve who you might imagine. In 1940, public housing was not targeted towards the poor. Instead, the federal government targeted employed, intact nuclear families of moderate, but not high, nor low income. And we know that actually from Ryan Allen and Dave Van Riper's work on this topic. Some sources have mentioned that public housing was built to serve the submerged middle class. So families of moderate income who had been harmed by the Depression, potentially upwardly mobile, but essentially not the poor. And what did public housing provide during this era? Well, I think at its base, it provided access to better housing at modest but not low rents. It also provided housing of high quality materials and amenities, the quality of which matched the quality of any decent quality private housing in US cities of the time. It also provided effective management. Individuals who were responsible for operating public housing were responsive to tenant concerns. And then for the individual family, it provided a source of stability in order to focus on other aspects of their life, as well as the community in public housing, and we saw that a little bit in the previous photo. Now, it is important to talk about racial segregation because unlike many New Deal era policy investments, African-American families were not excluded from public housing. In fact, around 25% of units were reserved for Black families, but as was common at the time, these were completely segregated developments. Developments were largely either Black or white. At the same time, quality improvements in housing were large for both Black and white families, but potentially larger for Black families who had very constrained options in the housing market during this era. Okay, let's get into the long-run effects of public housing. We're looking at two outcomes, mortality and education. So we're looking at mortality in terms of age at death, and we're looking at the number of years of completed education, as well as a binary of whether or not someone completed high school. Our data sources. First, the 1940 full count census, really the true monarch of American full count data. My colleagues Ryan Allen and Dave Van Riper get full credit for identifying all 29,000 public housing units in the 1940 census, which contained 39,000 children. We're also using the 2000 census decennial long form, which was sent to 1 in 6 households and collected more detailed information than was on the short form census. And then we're also using the census numident file, the Social Security Administration's data on mortality through the end of 2024. Now, to identify public housing developments during this time, you first needed to figure out where they were, and then you needed to identify the enumeration district. The enumeration district maps are extremely easy to use, no trouble at all. They're actually better now than they used to be, but I really give them a lot of credit for doing these in 1940. They're available from the National Archives largely. Then we use Sanborn fire insurance maps to identify the addresses of the housing development units, and we take that information back to the full count census to identify the households. And so that's great. That's a year of work, but then we also need a comparison group. The comparison group that we have settled on as being potentially the most valuable using full count data is neighbors who live in the same enumeration districts. And so it's these folks, right? So this is the public housing development here at the bottom. These are people who live right near the public housing development. Now, of course, not all neighbors live right across the street from a public housing development, but for all intents and purposes, think about it as individuals who are living in the same parts of cities as residents of public housing. We're also creating a kind of a broader comparison group of residents of the same cities, those folks who you would expect the pool of residents in public housing would be drawn from. Then we're adjusting differences between public housing residents and these groups for admission criteria for public housing at the time. Now, we're not able to observe all admission criteria for public housing, but we know that public housing operators at the time focused on intact families, household structure, employment, and income necessary to afford the rent, but not too high. And we're also controlling for household education. That was not a admission criterion, but we have the information, so we're going to include it. We're then linking these individuals to the numident for mortality and to the census long form for educational attainment. And we're doing this through the Census Bureau's protected identity key system. Now, protected identity keys, which you heard about during today's lunch keynote, are incredibly valuable. And the problem is that only about 40% of respondents in the 1940 census received PICs. So this could be a huge problem for what we want to do, because we don't really have an infinite number of public housing residents. The good news is that children are much more likely to receive PICs. And the better news is that individuals in public housing were actually more likely to receive PICs than our comparisons. Why this is, I'd be happy to talk at length. I have some theories, but we really don't know. So then we do our linkage. We have the 1940 full count census, which provides us our public housing data. We link that to mortality through 2024 and to the 2000 census for completed education. The beauty of full count data is that we have large samples of people linked even across many, many decades. So this is the number of people in each group that we have mortality information on. And I won't, I'll spare you lots of the details here, but we're talking about millions in the citywide comparison group and still tens of thousands in the public housing group. In terms of the 2000 census, we're much more limited, of course, because only 1 in 6 people got it to begin with, and you had to survive all the way to the year 2000. But we're still getting a good number of people in all these groups. And so it really is the power of the Census Bureau's linking infrastructure that we're able to do this. All right, let's get into the results. So this is a model predicting age at death as a function of our public housing status, comparing public housing to neighbors and the citywide comparison. These are our controls. And most of the results I show you will be in the form of graphs, but this I do want to just kind of show you some numbers here so that it's clear. Thanks. So when we compare neighbors, we find that individuals in public housing are living 0.86 years longer than their neighbors, adjusting for admission criteria for public housing. Compared to citywide, they're living 0.662 years longer than their counterparts citywide. And so essentially what this means is that public housing residents are living between a half a year and a year longer than their counterparts in the neighborhood and citywide. When we look at these effects by race, we see a pretty similar story for Black and white individuals. You could maybe make the argument that the longevity benefit is a little bit smaller for Black individuals, but those are wider confidence intervals. Now, moving on to education, this is going to show you the difference in years of completed education. And what we're finding is that public housing residents go on to complete a quarter to a half more years of education than their counterparts citywide and in the neighborhood. When we look at these effects by race, again, we see similar direction for each group. Although in this case, you could make the argument that the effect is actually larger for Black individuals than for white individuals, but there's a fair amount of overlap. And then finally, differences in the likelihood of completing high school. We find that individuals in public housing are between 5 and 9 percentage points more likely to go on to complete high school than their counterparts in the neighborhood and citywide. So what do we find, just wrapping up in the long-run effects of public housing? We find longer lives for individuals who grew up in public housing and who are there in 1940. We also find more years of education for individuals who are living in public housing in 1940. And these pictures here really show exactly what we're talking about. These are the kids who are growing up in public housing. They went on to live longer, get more education. And it's not unlikely that these two things are related, that public housing does set individuals on a trajectory to attain more education, potentially earn more and live longer. Some limitations that I'll run through quickly and just get to the next steps. This is not a random assignment. There's still potential selection into public housing. Happy to talk about that later on. Selection into linkage, Trent mentioned that. There are some things we can do with it, but not a ton. And one issue is that this is a snapshot observation of public housing residents. We know where people lived on census day in 1940. We're fixing this by also doing the same thing for the 1950 full count census. And next step is to look at tax records. So thank you so much.
Good afternoon. I'm here to talk about the effect of redlining, specifically, excuse me, exposure in the 1940s, close to when these maps were drawn, and health outcomes much later in life. And Andy has thankfully saved me a bunch of time going through the background. Basically, social terms of health, somewhere between 30 and 70% of our health outcomes. Somebody earlier mentioned some of the work by Almond and Curie. And basically, what we want to figure out is what's the role of structural racism and how can we link historical exposures and effects through time. And the specific background here is on redlining. So as part of the New Deal in the 1930s, there was a homeowners loan corporation which were building these mortgage security maps, supposedly for the risk of default, but the language they used was starkly racist in its area descriptions, and the red color blocks that they created for neighborhoods that were that had large proportions of Black residents gave rise to the name redlining. These were probably not created early enough to be used in the HOLC's lending decisions, but likely were for likely influenced later lending decisions by other bodies. And these are still associated with area housing segregation, worse economic outcomes, and area level worse health outcomes. So just as a timeline here, the period we're thinking about here is between the 1930 and 1940 census, and these maps are being drawn approximately 1938. And then we're going to link this up with the health and retirement study, which goes from 1992 to the present day. So we're borrowing a conceptual framework from Carolyn Swope, which is adopted from Krieger and all, looking at the effects of on present-day health. So much of the previous literature, it's either been at the area level or at the individual level, but using present-day residents rather than people who lived in these places back in the 1940s. And there's been one published article, a little bit in the gray literature, but they only cover cities that covered about 44% of the US urban population. So our hypothesis is that living in a redlined area in 1940 worsens mortality later in life and worsens self-rated health later in life. And we leveraged the 1940 census enumeration districts and the IPUMS census linkage in the health and retirement study. So yeah, census enumeration districts are not easy to work with. So there's a bunch of things that we know, but mainly the thing that we don't know is like we have the maps in the archive of these enumeration districts, but they're digitized but not georeferenced. So they're a little bit difficult to use for geographical analysis. But that is our linkage for like where people are, although I'm learning from this conference that that maybe I could just get people's exact locations. So these were basically what an enumerator could cover in the amount of time. They were drawn by supervisors. You can kind of see University of Minnesota across the river there, and like handwritten like numbers which refer to the enumeration districts. And they never really were intended for public use. And so there's been some attempts to map these already. So there's a set from Logan and Jane at Brown University that's like a very meticulous process, but they're missing New York City, which is a lot of people, and it only includes incorporated city boundaries for these 40 cities and excludes a lot of near suburbs. And there are about 400 US cities in 1940. So we're going to algorithmically approximate the location of the remaining enumeration districts. So we use the geographic reference file also from the Urban Transition Project. And so for about 200 of these cities, we have the enumeration district, the enumeration district identifier and the street addresses. And then we're going to, so this solves some of our problems with missing data. And basically, we're going to brute force like the location of these using some admittedly like assumptions that we know are wrong, right? So one assumption is that the 1940 addresses are named the same and numbered the same as today, which we know that they aren't. But we're looking for kind of the approximate shape of these enumeration districts rather than exact locations of each one. And the second assumption kind of follows the first. So the second assumption, any kind of urban renewal, right, which might have pushed addresses to different locations. So we undergo through some matching steps, and I'm just going to demonstrate for you. So this is a section of West Philadelphia. Each dot is a 1940 street address that we've used 2023 geocodes for. And the different colors refer to different enumeration districts. And so first approximation, we just draw a big circle around all of them. And you can see that some of them work decently well and others are massive and monstrous and we don't want to use those. So we do some trimming of addresses that kind of fall outside of the cluster. And so we end up with something that kind of looks like this. So for Philadelphia, Philadelphia is one of those cities that was that had enumeration districts mapped by the Urban Transition Project. And so these are their nice rectangular enumeration districts. And here's ours layered on top of that. So it's not a perfect fit. It's also not terrible. I mean, there's some like obvious mismatches, right? There's that those two enumeration districts located in the center of another enumeration district where like it doesn't look like they match, but overall, not too bad. And then, of course, the benefit of this is that we can get to cities that haven't been mapped yet by the Urban Transition Project. So this is Brooklyn addresses. These are the trimmed addresses in virtual enumeration districts. And then we've superimposed the HOLC redlining map on top of that. And then our enumeration districts with coded by the HOLC categories. And we, for cities where we have both these virtual enumeration districts and the urban transition projects, it's about a 98% match on HOLC grade. And since we think the urban transition project does a like a more precise job than us. We use theirs if they exist, but we end up covering about 84% of the US urban population versus 44%. So finally, like we get to the meat of this, right? Which is we use that linkage of the 1940 enumeration district now tagged with the HOLC redlining category, and we can apply that to the people who are in the health and retirement study. And so Rob Warren talked earlier, this is work that he's done to bring the linkage into the health and retirement study. And just a reminder of our hypothesis, it worsens mortality and it worsens self-rated health later in life. And this is about like 50 to 70 years later. So for mortality, we conceive of this as a time to event prospective study subject to left truncation because people will have because of the time lag between the 1940 census and the start of the health and retirement study data collection, and then also subject to right censoring because thankfully some of the participants were still alive at the end of the study period. And we use a parametric normal distribution maximum likelihood estimation regression model, which is what we can do there is we can model the shape of non-neonatal death kind of leading up to that point to account for some of that attenuation of disparities. And then for self-rated health, we dichotomize it into excellent and good versus all others. This is a pretty standard practice in the literature. And then we run a logistic regression. After our base model, we also stratify by race, by Black and white. And we originally included all other races, but there are too few people per HOLC category. Basically, everybody else lived in redlined areas. And we control for these and used personal level survey weights for the baseline year. So here are summary statistics. I just want to point out, you can kind of see that there's a little bit of a pattern in age of death and a little bit of a pattern in self-rated health. And also, contrary to some literature that's out there, there's a pretty, it's pretty strongly correlated with where people live by race. But it's also important to note that that a lot of white people also lived in redlined areas, even though they were redlined because Black people lived there. And so for our survival time mortality analysis, basically yellow and redlined areas, people who lived in yellow and redlined areas had about 60% the survival time versus those who lived in what the HLC considered the best areas. Which holds after adjustment. And then in the race stratified analysis for Black participants, it's about a fifth of the survival time, less than a fifth of the survival time. For red-lined and yellow-lined areas. For white participants in red-lined areas, it's about 60% of the time. And then after adjustment, both yellow and red-lined areas. And you can see that it's kind of bad for everyone, but it's even worse for Black residents. Similar patterns by self-rated health. So for self-rated health, we had quasi-complete separation, so we couldn't do stratification for Black residents. But there was about 2 times worse health in yellow and red-lined areas, which held after adjustment, and for white residents, similar results. Okay, so we found, worse survival time, worse self-rated health, and we found that our findings imply that structural racism harms all residents, even as its effects are concentrated in Black residents by like a factor of 3. And self-rated health for white participants was also worse. I'm gonna skip these. We have some limitations. I'm happy to talk about them in the questions. And for policy implications, this points to reparations for past harms of policy, to broad-based social investments to kind of make up for some of these. And also, in this year particularly, there's a lot of talk from DHS and elsewhere about the importance of, HHS and elsewhere, the importance of only looking at health research that affects all Americans. And I think a point that we want to make is that structural racism hurts everyone, and that you can't really consider how to address healthcare for all Americans if you don't look specifically at the harms that have been done. So additional work that we want to do in the future is we want to look at out-migration to kind of look at exposure time, which might help with selection. And there's a lot of people who have worked on this, but also here's a paper on the left is about the matching strategy, and preprint on the right on the mortality and self-rated health. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Thomas Storrs, and I want to thank everybody for being here, and thank you for having me. Our paper is Indexing Cards Linking FHA and VA Borrowers to the Census, and this is with Kate Thomas, Wenfei Zhu, and Jacob Faber. Thank you for everybody that gave us money. We really appreciate it. And also Risa Gals-Wachnick, who has done a lot of work to get this paper together. All right, here's a summary of it, sort of my plain language summary. We want to know who received FHA insured and VA guaranteed mortgages in these programs' early years. Currently, we don't know that much. If we really wanted to know every single loan, we'd have to go to the local land records office in the more than 3,000 counties across the United States. The one paper that exists, Fishback et al. From 2024, has 4,300 FHA records and in 3 counties, and that's a complete coverage from 1935 to 1940. Fortunately for this paper, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation Mortgage Company bought 100,000 FHA and VA loans and made little index cards to organize them. And those have borrower information, are at the National Archives, and their digital images available. So we take those, digitize them, pull out the information, and link them to the census. We find from the linked sample of about 30,000 that Black borrowers are underrepresented relative to population, and that foreign-born borrowers are proportionally represented. A little about the FHA and VA, and I want to include a quotation from Franklin Roosevelt in 1942. He said, "A nation of homeowners, of people who own a real share in their own land, is unconquerable." And early in his presidency, he signed the legislation for the FHA in 1934. This is the home on which the first FHA insured mortgage was made in Alexandria, Virginia. And the application for that mortgage noted approvingly that it had a racially restrictive covenant. By 1941, they'd insured 710,000 mortgages. The VA was at towards the end of Roosevelt's presidency in 1944, and it was similar. It guaranteed a portion of the mortgage, and so both of these programs did not make mortgages, but they lessened the downside for the private lender who did make the mortgage. The VA mortgage was a really good mortgage. It had a lower than market interest rate, low down payments. It was a very nice thing to have. And it was for returning veterans from World War II at first. The RFC-MC is a predecessor to the Federal National Mortgage Association, or Fannie Mae. And initially it bought FHA insured mortgages on new construction homes. Then once Fannie Mae existed, it bought existing construction, then it bought 2 other FHA programs, and eventually its last big thing was buying VA guaranteed mortgages in 1946 and 1947. Here's a chart reconstructed from RFCMC accounting records. So we'll do the orange and the gray, the first 2 for our FHA sample, and then that black at the end, which the accounting records didn't quite have all of it, but that's the VA purchases at the very end. We will not link the blue and the orangish yellow. And as you can see, we are covering during their eras about 5 to 10% of the total population of loans of that type at that time. All right, here are the cards, a picture of the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, and the boxes they came in. Thank you so much to the National Archives for digitizing these, and for our friends at the University of Michigan for paying to digitize the first batch of them from the Veterans Affairs. They just showed up online and we didn't know why. Thank you. So this is how we digitize them. Take the images, use AWS Textract to read the letters, and then AWS Comprehend along with Labelbox to train them to pick up the different parts of these, the borrower, the lender, an ID, the amount, all these different things we can get through there. And then we get, this big CSV with all this wonderful information in it. And then as we link, we drop some. So we drop Puerto Rico, we drop any state with fewer than 50 FHA or VA loan cards from the FHA or the VA side. We drop that Title I and Class 3 and the FHA Title VI, which were those 2 programs that the colors on the chart I said we didn't get. So eventually we have about 50,000 we try to link, and we link about 30,000. And now we'll move on. A little more on the linking. We use a modified ABE, inspired by ABE perhaps, and we do not have birth information, place or year for our borrowers. So we block on state first, and then first and last initial, and then Yarrow-Winkler distance of less than or equal to 0.1, which seems to be the standard conservative approach. And if we've got more than one match at that point, we do county, and then we use spouse. And we are trying to not miss subgroups that we really want to know about. And I think we do all right with that. And but there's more work to do on that. And but anyway, I think this is fairly standard with the information available. We limit, there's some more on the matching. We also do some validation with hand-linked records to Family Search, which I think is pretty good, but it's much better for white predictions than for black borrower predictions. We're better at matching on the FHA than the VA, and I've got some theories on that, but I'm happy to answer questions on that. The spatial distribution, we've gotten more in the South and the Midwest, and it especially tilts towards the South with the VA. We're not so much in the Northeast or out West. And now we'll move on to the results. Basically, the results are tricky to interpret. We adjust the black columns here to our state distribution. And so about 1 in 10 of the black population in 1940, that's the proportion there. And it's closer in the VA lending was much higher than the FHA lending relative to the veteran population in 1950. Loan sizes, non-Black loans were larger in VA and about the same for FHA. Here's foreign-born, as you can see, about the same for population and about the same for World War II veteran population. And then the loan sizes, the foreign-born loans are higher or larger in both cases. And here we have by state, and the size of these dots is the size of the number of loans in that state. You can see for FHA here on your left that it's less noisy and it seems to track better the percent Black in the state versus the percent Black in our RFCMC cards. The VA is noisier there on the right, and but it's still the same pattern of less than the proportion of the population. Foreign-born, it's seems to track right along that 45-degree line, and there you are. All right, we now move on to discussion, which I'm sort of doing a dry run of some of the discussion here after some helpful comments from reviewer number 2. So our results more broadly correct? We've got some concerns about bias. Our automated linking doesn't seem to be as good at Black borrowers, but it's still, I think it's very good. That there's some selection effects into RFCMC, and also that we exclude loans to developers, which I should have mentioned earlier. And that new construction we think is probably more likely to be white than the other loans. What explains our results for Black Americans? Basically, there are 3 broad categories of mechanisms that we think are at work here, and I think as we move forward, we'll think about how to disaggregate them, but they all sort of work together. And you know, just sort of the broader society is set up in the socioeconomic status of African Americans going into this. The programs from the start are rigged against Black borrowers, and then also that there's discrimination at the loan level, at the application level. What about foreign-born Americans? This is a more novel result. You know, nobody's really looked at this, whereas there's 8 decades of literature about the FHA's unfair treatment of African American borrowers. At a very coarse level, foreign-born borrowers seem to have been treated like native-born white borrowers. We do caution that we're not controlling for age, income, geography much here, so that it can be done in the future to an extent, but these results suggest assimilation. Here at the end, I want to say thank you again for having me, and our redlining lab, our other project is these maps. The Minneapolis one I'm pictured in front of here. It's massive, but these are FHA block maps that we're working on digitizing. I can answer questions about those too in the question time, but overall, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for listening.
Cool. All right, thanks for sticking around for the final session. I'm going to be talking about kind of a meta overview of a new data product we've been building in the RDCs to study housing, specifically eviction from rental housing. So eviction follows generally these 5 steps. This can happen really quick to renters, especially if you fall behind on rent. The typical renter is not represented in eviction court. Most evictions go to default judgments very quickly. Most landlords are represented, most renters are not represented. And so we know from survey data, qualitative research, that eviction can have really severe consequences that snowball very quickly for renters. What we know is that roughly 2.7 million unique renter households receive a filing every year. And so what I'm going to be talking about here in general is formal eviction, evictions that progress through the court process in housing court. And this is separate from eviction as just general form of involuntary displacement. So there's a lot of different work in different localities on what people generally think of as informal evictions. This can happen in tons of different ways. A landlord can refuse to offer you a renewal or offer you a renewal with 5 times the rent, all sorts of illegally change the locks on your door. We know these kind of things happen. Some estimates put these at about half as often as formal evictions. Some put them at 2 or 3 times as often as formal evictions. But what I'm talking about here is a court filing that the landlord files in the jurisdiction where they live. And so the data that I'm going to be describing comes from Princeton University's eviction lab, which tries to assemble something resembling a national eviction database. This involved a lot of data cleaning, validation, deduplication efforts. And then we can use this to basically make estimates of how many evictions get filed across the country. What we can't use this for is to say anything about who gets evicted. So eviction filings only contain names and addresses of defendants. They don't contain information like age, race, sex. And then we also can't use this to track what happens to defendants post-eviction. So we have some small-scale survey data, but it's really hard to follow people over time who are experiencing something like this. And so I will say there's lots of really great local work, a lot of which happens here at Hennepin County, that tries to do some linkage of court records to other data sources they have in-house, where people might report some of these things like age, race, and sex, like assistance data from different programs. But we really don't have any sort of national comprehensive linked database. And so what we've done through a lot of incredible folks at the Census Bureau helping us out are brought in these eviction records from the Eviction Lab's national database to the FSRDC system. And I'm going to talk about how we then link those to census administrative data, some of the projects we've already finished and published, and then some of the next steps of where we're going with this work. So like I mentioned, the filing itself only contains the names and address of the plaintiff and defendants. We rely on the person identification validation system, which we've learned a lot about throughout the day, that tries to assign one of these keys, which are called PICs, to individuals based on sort of all these different modules that take advantage of tons of data holdings that the Census Bureau has. And so often we're working with the PBS team is working with a source record that has name and address, but also other stuff like date of birth, maybe even social security number. And when it goes through PBS, we end up with either PICs or unmatched records. And when we have more data, we can kind of do some validation of maybe we have date of birth and we can say, are we doing a better or worse job linking older folks, or younger folks? The problem with eviction records is we only have names and addresses, so we don't really know who we're missing. We've so far been able to link through the PBS system about 65% of individuals who show up on court records to a PIC. We've done a lot of work just using what we can infer based on name and address to try to get a grip on who might we be missing, what kind of bias might that introduce, mostly by using the address to look at geographic correlates. We haven't found anything particularly concerning. We've tested using inverse probability weights based on these geographic predictors. And so far, those haven't had a huge impact on our final statistics, but happy to talk about potential bias more in our discussion. So once you have a PIC attached to an individual, we can then attach that individual by using that PIC to any other data source that's been picked. So this includes tons of national data sets as well as a lot of state level data sets the Census PBS team has now attached PICs to. So I'm going to talk through some projects and what we've learned by just merging folks by PICs to the big ones we've heard a lot about today, the decennial censuses, the American Community Survey, and the Social Security Numident file. And at the end, I'll talk about some next steps where we're linking to some of these other more recently picked data sets. So if we have a PIC, this is a longitudinal identifier. We can follow the same person over time. And something really useful we can do here is if we know this person was filed against for eviction in 1 year, we can see if they responded to something like a decennial census or the American Community Survey right before that happened. And so this lets us both attach individual characteristics reported in those data to those individuals. But really importantly, it also lets us observe the entire household roster before that filing happened. And why this is important is because filings themselves will often leave people off who are in that household. So this might include adults who aren't on the lease. It might include adults for whatever reason. These are never in court. These are never sort of validated against who is actually living in that household. And really importantly, they'll virtually never include children. And so if we attach the census, we can then see how many kids are living in that household. And then we can also attach the things further down the line, like the Numident file, to look at mortality. And so we have one paper just laying out a demographic profile of the population threatened by eviction in the United States. This is a population age pyramid comparing the dark line, which is the renter population, to the orange bars, which are the population threatened with eviction. What we're able to show with this linkage is that eviction is overwhelmingly concentrated in households that have kids. And also there are extremely large racial disparities in eviction filing. Over 25% of Black women living with children are threatened with eviction each year. We also look at the relationship between eviction and long-term mortality, finding judgments especially are associated with a 40% increase in mortality. And then also have done some more tight temporal work right around the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic. Finding excess mortality for renters threatened with eviction was over 100% during this time. We're approaching the release of a county level data tool. All these papers have only used national, state level aggregates that go through the typical disclosure review process. We've been kind of going through a much longer, slower review process of releasing county level statistics. And this will end up taking the form of an interactive tool where you can look at things like racial disparities in filing rates in your county and download that data and use it for analysis. And so, yeah, we're working through negotiating a lot of differential privacy stuff. Two papers I wanted to mention that are more in the working paper stage have to do with these data sets. So one is that the Census Bureau, we've heard a lot about PICs being attached to the decennial census today, but the Census Bureau has also been doing a ton of work attaching PICs to all sorts of other data sets. So they've used these sort of, attaching PICs to tax records, program data from things like SNAP and WIC. They use these to build sort of various comprehensive data sets. One is called the Residence Candidate File, which tries to be an annual address history of every PIC based on all of those different data sources where you might report your address. So we can imagine here, you live at one address for 3 years, and then a different one for a couple of years, and then a different one for a couple of years after that. And then we can see, like, how does an eviction affect residential trajectories? And so we're examining how folks move to different places following a filing, even if that filing doesn't result in a judgment. And then how this filtering process really entrenches residential segregation as well. Through a lot of data use agreements with states, the census has also been working to produce something called the Post-Secondary Employment Outcomes Dataset, or PSEO. This sort of shows state level coverage through negotiating data use agreements with states who have collected student records from most of the university systems in those states to basically take the student records, enrollment records at 2- and 4-year institutions and attach PICs to those individuals. And so this coverage is pretty good in a lot of states. And so in our project, we've now also gone and got permission from 7 states to use those PICs to attach those student records to evictions and other census data. And so part of this has been a big project looking at parenting students, especially as sort of a follow-up to what kinds of households with kids are really threatened with eviction at really high rates. One thing we've noticed is that filing rates are actually really high at housing around college campuses. And through all this linkage, we're able to control for things like demographics, but also income of students and parents in the year before they might receive an eviction filing, as well as being able to have fixed effects on things like enrollment year and institution. And we find evictions associated with a reduction likelihood of degree completion, reduced post-enrollment income, and post-enrollment mortality, looking at folks about 5 to 10 years out. And so if you want to learn more about the student data specifically and some of the findings from that, we just published a working paper with my Census co-authors, as well as a policy brief with New America, who funded a lot of this work. So next steps are updating the national data linkage through 2023. And then at that point, also moving towards making some of these clean linked data sets available across the RDCs for researchers. I think I'm going to stop there. I really want to thank, this work would have been totally impossible without amazing collaborators at the Census Bureau, especially Sonia Porter and Danny Sandler. But we now have a huge team of folks internally at the Census building out a lot of these products for researchers to use. And hopefully it'll keep growing this year, but we'll see. Thanks.